The wildly successful world of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon reveals many real-life influences, with author George R.R. Martin stating how the War of the Roses in England especially had a significant influence on the creation of this world. Some of the characters have obvious resemblances to real-life historical figures, and some are less obvious. Some of these comparisons are based on personal opinion, so please let me know if you disagree or have any other suggestions. Aegon the Unworthy, Henry VIII. Aegon IV, known as Aegon the Unworthy, the 11th Targaryen king to sit on the Iron Throne, was considered one of the worst Targaryen kings in Westerosi history. There was much promise at the beginning of his reign, which he began as a young, handsome, and vigorous man. Henry VIII succeeded his father, Henry VII, in 1509 at the age of 17. He too was healthy, and the future of his reign looked promising. Both men, however, through pride, gluttony, and unchecked desires, brought misery and upheaval to many, with death and war being the legacy not only in their lifetimes, but long after. Henry would carry out many politically motivated executions, ensuring loyalty from those around him. Aegon IV would fill his own court with those who would flatter him, instead of those who were wise or noble. Both Aegon IV and Henry VIII took on military campaigns which ultimately proved to be failures. Aegon IV chose to attempt to invade Dorne with caches of wildfire, which went up in flame on the outskirts of King's Landing. He would also attempt to invade by sea, however his fleet of warships were destroyed in a storm. Henry VIII was fixated on France, and his first major campaign there saw him join the Pope's Holy League against the French in an expensive and unsuccessful campaign. Later in his reign in 1544, he again sought to expand his holdings in France, however he would fail twice in a row in another fruitless and costly campaign, even losing the last English stronghold of Calais. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, could be compared to Bethany Bracken. Catherine was much younger than Henry, and like Bethany, managed to displace another, more conservative wife, and in both of these cases married an old, bad-tempered king. They both sought comfort in affairs with other men, and were both caught, Catherine being caught with Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham, close friends of Henry, and Bethany being caught with a handsome member of Aegon's Kingsguard, Terence Toyne. In both cases, the women, as well as their lovers, were executed. Henry gave and took to and from his associates on a whim, giving houses meant for some to others, with people falling in and out of favour for whether or not they pleased him, such as Thomas Cromwell. He took land from monasteries and gave it to those he favoured. Aegon would take from one noble house and give to another, such as gifting the great hills of the Teats to the Blackwoods from the Brackens. If he needed wealth, he would strip men of their rightful inheritance. These two kings both died terribly. Aegon's body was so obese that he could not stand up. His flesh was rotting and infected, and smelled foul. Henry too was unable to rise. He had ulcers all over his legs and feet, with doctors unable to help. The legacies left behind by these two men may be their worst features. Aegon IV chose to legitimise all his bastards on his deathbed, which led to 5 Blackfire rebellions as different pretenders fought for the throne, leading to decades of conflict and thousands of deaths. Henry VIII, through his Reformation, left the country torn apart as Catholics and Protestants would fight each other for generations. Khal Drogo and Genghis Khan. The Horse Lord Khal Drogo, like Genghis Khan, had intentions of conquering the entire world. Khal Drogo's intention was to expand his empire as far and as wide as possible, and his son, with Daenerys Targaryen, was to be the stallion that mounted the world. Genghis Khan, in turn, sought to expand the Mongol Empire as far as possible. The native home of the Dothraki, the tribe led by Khal Drogo, is the vast central plains of the continent of Essos, known as the Dothraki Sea. This can certainly show a similarity to Mongolia, a similarly vast open plain in Central Asia, and at its peak stretching into Europe. The culture of horses is another prominent aspect that can be seen in both empires. The Dothraki are horse-mounted warriors who bond with their horses so strongly that they are even said to be born, fight, and die in the saddle. Similarly, Genghis Khan is quoted as having said, "It is easier to conquer the world from the back of a horse." Horses provided the Mongols with food, drink, transportation, armour, and spiritual power, much as they do to the Dothraki. The Mongols' military tactics were built around cavalry charges, as well as mounted cavalry archers, as can be seen in one of the scenes of the Dothraki in Game of Thrones. In fact, a traditional Mongol saying is, "A Mongol without a horse is like a bird without the wings." The importance of horses in their culture is mirrored in the Dothraki, who in fact worship a horse god called the Great Stallion, and believe that when they die, their soul will ride with their ancestors in the Nightlands. Khal Drogo was not afraid of raiding, burning, and pillaging any who was in his path, frequently invading nearby regions to plunder and take what he wanted. Scenes in Game of Thrones show the Dothraki massacring villages and enslaving their people, such as the shepherds of Lazar. Genghis Khan, of course, as the great founder of the Mongol Empire, was renowned for his brutal conquests and destruction of hundreds of cities and villages, occupying much of Central Asia and China by the end of his life. The most conservative estimates of the number of dead as a result of his military campaigns is 4 million, with some being as high as 60 million. Policies of complete obliteration destroyed cultures, literature, religions, and ways of life. Finally, the death of Viserys Targaryen at the hands of Khal Drogo through pouring molten gold on his head is strikingly similar to the death of Inalchuk, a governor of the Khwarezmian Empire, who was allegedly executed by having molten silver poured on his head and in his eyes and ears. Cersei Lannister, Margaret of Anjou. Cersei Lannister, the wife of Robert Baratheon and daughter of Tywin Lannister, was one of the most despised characters in Game of Thrones for her cruelty, malice, and inhumanity. She gains political power through scheming, manipulation, and political manoeuvring. Similarly, Margaret of Anjou, the Queen of England for over 50 years, has a legacy of being ruthless, conniving, and outright cruel. How much this reputation was influenced by the sexist tropes in medieval society could be debated, however. The War of the Roses between the House of Lancaster and the House of York is mirrored in the wars between the Lannisters and the Starks. Cersei Lannister and his son Joffrey arguably kick-started this war by beheading Ned Stark, the head of House Stark. Margaret of Anjou, who essentially ruled the kingdom due to her husband Henry VI's bouts of insanity, sparked the War of the Roses. Through the creation of a great council in 1455, this council would exclude Richard of York, the head of the Yorkist faction. Margaret would appear to have been much braver than Cersei Lannister, being one of the most prominent figures and leaders of the House of Lancaster, even personally leading her faction, as opposed to operating further in the shadows like Cersei Lannister. Ned Stark was certainly a threat to Cersei Lannister, as were his sons, and its obvious enmity is mirrored in the rivalry between Margaret and the Duke of York. Margaret viewed him as a threat to the king's authority, and by extension, hers. Margaret was able to control and manipulate Henry behind the scenes to do her bidding, much as Cersei would attempt to when both of her sons sat on the Iron Throne, as well as when her husband Robert was drinking, hunting, and sleeping with other women. Rumours abounded that the son of Margaret, Edward of Westminster, was in fact the son of the Duke of Somerset, and not King Henry, while the children of Cersei Lannister are known to have been the offspring of her incestuous affair with her brother Jaime. The two were both very protective of their children, this being Cersei's only redeeming quality, according to her younger brother Tyrion. Both women would lose their children in the wars they played a major role in starting. Margaret's son was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury, allegedly beheaded by a man he pleaded to for help. Two of Cersei's children were poisoned by rival houses, and one was driven to suicide by her own actions. Margaret is described by Shakespeare as worse than a wolf. However, Cersei Lannister is surely an exaggerated version of the worst version of Margaret. Peter Baelish and Oliver Cromwell. After the execution of Charles I and the establishment of a Republican Commonwealth, Oliver Cromwell declared himself to be the Lord Protector and head of state. Peter Baelish, known as Littlefinger, is also given the new title of Lord Protector of the Realm when he marries Lysa Arryn, the Lady Regent of the Vale of Arryn. Cromwell was a very ambitious man. He could also be seen as hypocritical, as he used the cause of anti-monarchical republicanism as a method to gain ultimate power for himself, but then behaved in the very manners of the royalty that had preceded him. In fact, he decreed that his son would take his position after his death, just as a prince would become a king. Littlefinger is known to covet the Iron Throne, both in the books and the series, and certainly schemes and manipulates to climb as high up the social ladder as possible. As well as Oliver Cromwell, the life and death of Thomas Cromwell also mirrors the actions of Littlefinger. The two started out as relative nobodies. Thomas, the son of a blacksmith, he worked his way up to becoming an MP, and then Henry VIII's chief minister, taking care to flatter Henry and help him achieve his much-wanted divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Baelish was the grandson of a sellsword who thrived on conflict and chaos to elevate himself also. Thomas Cromwell had spies everywhere and used his knowledge much like Littlefinger. Cromwell was responsible for the arrest of Thomas More, who was executed for refusing to acknowledge Henry as the supreme head of the church. This power move mirrors the arrest of Ned Stark, orchestrated by Littlefinger, who furthered his position by aligning with the Lannisters. Thomas Cromwell also played a role in the demise of Anne Boleyn to further his own position, permitting her to be tortured to extract a false confession of adultery. Like Littlefinger, he met a sticky end, as his promotion of Anne of Cleves as Henry's wife proved disastrous. Like Littlefinger, he now had many political rivals who had no qualms about bringing about his demise, and like Littlefinger, he was tried for treason and executed. Of course, Littlefinger's grand schemes never came to fruition. Unlike Cromwell's, once the Starks discovered it was him who had betrayed Ned Stark, sold Sansa Stark into marriage and murdered Lysa Tully, he was swiftly executed and his schemes all came crashing down. Oliver Cromwell, of course, at least managed to rule as Lord Protector for nearly 5 years, although he himself was in fact posthumously executed in 1661. Girolamo Savonarola, the High Sparrow. Girolamo Savonarola was an Italian friar who practiced asceticism, that is, a lifestyle which abstains from sensual pleasures. He was active in Florence during the Renaissance. The extravagance of Florence under the Medici family disgusted him, and he preached judgment and prophecies of the end of the world and condemnation of the modern lifestyles of those in Florence. The High Sparrow is the leader of the Sparrow movement, based on the faith of the Seven, the Westerosi equivalent of Christianity. He dresses in a simple tunic, shunning materialism and displaying his contempt for the excesses and impulses of those living in King's Landing. In his preaching, Savonarola placed the blame for the spread of syphilis in Italy on sexual transgressions and homosexuals. The High Sparrow arrested Loras Tyrell for being homosexual, as well as Cersei Lannister for her adultery with Lancel Lannister, where she is ultimately forced to take the Walk of Atonement through King's Landing. Savonarola is famed for burning thousands of objects such as books, art, cosmetics, and other items associated with materialism, in what is well known as the Bonfire of the Vanities. The influence wielded by the High Sparrow through carrying out such trials of wealthy and powerful members of aristocracy made him one of the most powerful people in King's Landing. Savonarola, at the height of his influence, could be considered the de facto ruler of the Republic of Florence. He would conscript young male followers to go door to door, monitoring the behaviour of the citizens. These fanatics were known as weepers, and can be compared to the sparrows that operate under the eye of the High Sparrow. These two men both met quite unfortunate ends also. Savonarola was excommunicated by Pope Alexander in 1497, and later declared a heretic. Under torture he confessed to having invented his prophecies and visions, and was executed in 1498. The High Sparrow was blown up by wildfire by Cersei Lannister while awaiting her trial. A character yet to appear in House of the Dragon, named the Shepherd, can also be compared to Savonarola. The Shepherd is a fanatical brother of the Faith of the Seven, who wore rags and breeches and carried a begging bowl around his neck. He preached about doom and destruction and against Rhaenyra Targaryen. Without giving away too much, he plays a significant and devastating role in the series. Much like Savonarola, he preached against aristocracy and any kind of materialism, and could not be reasoned with, as he didn't seek any material or monetary luxury. Robert Baratheon, Edward IV. Robert Baratheon took the Iron Throne from the Mad King Aerys II Targaryen, the last of the Targaryen kings, after he rebelled along with other houses against the throne. Aerys had the Targaryen madness, and his hair and beard were unwashed and his nails yellow and long. Edward IV of the House of York would also usurp the throne from another mentally unstable king, Henry VI of the House of Lancaster, a pious man whose madness left him in a catatonic state for months at a time. Both Edward and Robert were very tall, strong men, handsome in their youth and with a promiscuous side also. Robert and his two brothers closely mirror the three sons of York, Edward, George and Richard. Robert Baratheon's brother Renly married Marjorie Tyrell, a member of a rich and powerful house, while Edward's brother George married Isabel Neville, sister of the Queen Consort, before he rebelled against his brother. Robert's other younger brother Stannis seeks the Iron Throne, believing his nephews Joffrey and Tommen were illegitimate. Similarly, Richard III, Edward's other younger brother, claimed the throne for himself, after issuing a decree that his nephews were illegitimate also. Robert had married into the Lannister family. His court would be full of members of the Lannisters. He would himself grumble about being surrounded by Lannisters. Similarly, as Edward had married Elizabeth Woodville, he would find members of the Woodvilles always close at hand, a family that had a notorious, often negative reputation that would cause significant contempt from Edward's brothers. We can also see how these two kings both had their greatest moments in their youth, before facing a downfall as they grew older and had to deal with the day-to-day tasks associated with being king. Robert was said to have changed after becoming king, and not for the better. He hated dealing with coin, crops, or justice, attending 3 small council meetings in 17 years. He also drained the crown's coffers through extravagant tournaments and feasts, leaving the crown severely in debt. Edward, in his youth, was a capable and charismatic commander, however in his later reign, much less energetic and vigorous. He too affected finances, creating taxes for wars, which he would then instead use to finance household expenditures. His spending exceeded income, and when he died, the crown had less than £1,200 in cash, and his relationship with the Medici Bank of Florence ended in bankruptcy. Robert became harsher. Where he had previously pardoned many who opposed his rebellion, he now sought to kill Daenerys Targaryen and her unborn child, just as Edward became crueler, having his brother George, Duke of Clarence, executed for treason. Finally, it was alleged that through his promiscuity, Edward fathered many illegitimate children, as he had many mistresses beside his wife, although only a few were recognised. Robert Baratheon fathered many illegitimate children also. In fact, they were all ordered to be killed by the Lannisters to prevent any challenge to Joffrey's succession. The last 2 comparisons here are taken from the successful prequel to Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, based on the book Fire and Blood. This series focuses on the Targaryen civil war that occurred as 2 rival factions fought for the Iron Throne. One big historical influence upon this series can be seen in the period in British history known as the Anarchy, between 1138 and 1158, where civil war gripped the country through a war of succession. There was a breakdown in law and order, with vicious infighting and families being destroyed. Much of this has, and certainly will be seen in House of the Dragon. Viserys Targaryen was the 5th Targaryen king to sit the Iron Throne. His grandfather was the old king Jaehaerys I, who was the longest reigning Targaryen king, overseeing a peaceful and prosperous realm for 55 years. Viserys inherited the throne after a great council elected him, as his father Baelor had passed away. He was selected over his cousin Rhaenys, who became known as the Queen Who Never Was. King Henry I also jumped ahead of another to take the throne, securing it from his older brother Robert. There was argument over who should become king after Henry's brother William I was killed by an arrow while hunting. While Robert was absent, Henry mustered up enough support to crown himself king. The reign of Viserys was peaceful and quite stable as he continued his father's legacy. He was known as Viserys the Pleasant and was famous for his generosity, ruling for 26 years until his death. While Henry I was perhaps more of a stereotypical warrior king than Viserys, he too had a long and stable reign as king. The strong similarity between these two kings is seen in the fact that both kings lost a male heir prematurely, which resulted in them naming their daughter as the heirs, going against the prevailing cultures of the time. Henry's heir, William Adelin, died in the White Ship tragedy, where a ship he was in, crossing the English Channel, sunk, killing him. After this, Henry would name his daughter Matilda as his heir, while he worked to gain support for her and to prepare her to rule after his death. Matilda's claim to the throne would be disputed, leading to the outset of the anarchy and civil war. Viserys had been obsessed with having a son to continue his line of succession. When his wife Aemma finally managed to give birth to a boy, she would die in childbirth, and the baby would die one day after his birth. When Viserys learned of his brother Daemon making jibes about Baelon, naming him heir for a day, he would decide to name his daughter Rhaenyra Targaryen as his heir instead. Like Matilda, Rhaenyra's claim to the throne would also be challenged, in this case leading to the civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons. The two kings therefore left behind a kingdom enveloped in chaos, uncertainty, and destruction. Viserys and Henry both took oaths of loyalty from lords, noblemen, and other royalty to their daughters, named as heirs. Both would unfortunately have these oaths ignored and cast aside when the time came, however. The two kings remarried after the deaths of their wives. However, they would never truly get over the deaths of their first loves, and as they passed away, war would soon come. Rhaenyra Targaryen and Empress Matilda. Before I continue, there will be major spoilers for fans of House of the Dragon, as I will be discussing the development and fate of Rhaenyra Targaryen in the books Fire and Blood, so please stop listening if you do not want to know what happens after Season 1 of House of the Dragon. Rhaenyra Targaryen was the firstborn child of King Viserys I Targaryen, his only living child by his first wife. She was made heir to the Iron Throne by her father as a girl, over other male potential claimants. She would therefore grow up expecting to become the first Queen of Westeros, staying by her father's side during small council meetings and at court. Empress Matilda was the daughter of Henry V. She became the heir to the throne when her brother died in 1120. Barons were forced to swear oaths of allegiance to Matilda, and as Henry had no more legitimate heirs, Matilda expected to become the queen upon his death. When Viserys Targaryen died, his throne was usurped by his male son, Aegon II, Rhaenyra's half-brother, who claimed the throne while Rhaenyra was away from the capital. Alicent Hightower, Viserys' second wife and mother of Aegon, claimed that Viserys had named Aegon as his heir on his deathbed. While at first diplomacy was attempted, events soon escalated into a full-blown civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons. Similarly, Matilda was betrayed by a close male relative when her father Henry I died. She was away in Anjou in France. News of Henry's death reached her cousin Stephen of Blois, who left for England and seized power for himself, and was proclaimed the new monarch in front of the crowds in London. In this case, Stephen's brother Henry had claimed that the king had changed his mind on his deathbed. Rhaenyra sought support throughout Westeros for her claim to the throne, with many lords and houses pledging their support, such as Corlys Velaryon and her uncle and husband Daemon, who immediately sought to seize strategic castles in Westeros. Similarly, Matilda gained support from the enemies of Steffan, as those who rebelled against him joined her cause. For example, the first Earl of Devon, who had previously rebelled against Steffan, as well as Matilda's half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, whose open rebellion began the descent into civil war. Rhaenyra and Matilda would both carry out invasions to seize what they believed was their birthright, by force. In both cases, there were many battles between the two factions, with moments of great victory and terrible loss for all sides. Rhaenyra Targaryen did manage at one point to sit the Iron Throne, taking the capital King's Landing from her half-brother. However, she was unable to hold it for more than half a year, before being driven out by angry citizens and a lack of money. For a brief moment, Matilda managed to rule in 1141. However, ultimately, Steffan's army and support proved too strong. While Rhaenyra Targaryen ultimately perished in the Dance of the Dragons, her son, Aegon III, would ultimately become the king after all the fighting was done. Matilda was more fortunate, and although she did not become queen, a compromise was reached, in which her heir, Henry II, would become the king after Steffan. While there are certainly differences in character, personality and circumstances, the influences of these historical figures upon the world of Westeros cannot be denied. Quite often George R.R. Martin's characters are exaggerated versions of these historical figures. It is very interesting to compare the two, and sometimes real history is more incredible and unbelievable than the fictionalized ones.